Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asbah Tabatabai, and my INDS major is Sociocultural Education, and I'm also getting certification in elementary ed. My Capstone project is about the teaching and assessment of immigrant students and the role of their teachers' expectations at the elementary school level. I'd like to begin by thanking my faculty advisors, Barbara Bourne from Education, who's here. Thank you so much for being here. And Chrissy Lindemeyer from History, also Mr. McAlpin from INDS, and the teachers who generously shared their time with me and were interviewed for this project, as well as my professors, friends, and classmates who helped me get in touch with them. I'd also like to thank feedback for all the people who gave me feedback during my practice presentations. And lastly, my family for their support. So even though I would want to ideally give all the details about my findings and give examples and everything that I found out, for the sake of time, I will give a brief reason as to why I chose to do this project, the various components of my projects and my findings, and why I think it's important. I came to America as an immigrant when I was in high school. In the public school that I went to in the U.S., I was right away put in an ESL class as a result of the assumptions that were made about me by administrators who knew nothing about me. Many of my teachers never really found out anything about who I am, where I was coming from, what experiences and knowledge I was bringing with me. And this experience nearly derailed my academic career, and it took me several years to recapture that sense of self-efficacy and confidence that I had about myself as a learner. This is my story as an immigrant student. Is this the story of many others too? If it is, why is it so? This is the background as to why this research project came about. The achievement gap between mainstream and minority students is quite significant. These are long-term trends that have been reported since the 1960s by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And they show scores in reading, writing, and mathematics. And I think this problem will become only worse as our immigrant population is increasing. The purpose of this project was to gain a better understanding of the issue, and better and more comprehensive understanding of the issues that are involved with the teaching of immigrant students, and also to learn from real-world examples for myself as a pre-professional teacher. I focused on two questions. How are immigrant students taught and assessed, and what are their teachers' expectations from them? Assessment in this case I'm using to describe daily activities like classwork, homework, quizzes, and class participation rather than big exams. This is my initial exploration, just not for you to read because you can't honestly read it, but it just the purpose is to show how interconnected and complex the research question is and why it truly requires an interdisciplinary approach. And I explored various other disciplines like political science and history, but for the project I ended up focusing on sociology and anthropology, psychology, and the field of education. I also drew upon several concepts, that of cultural capital, which refers to the knowledge, attitudes, skills, and experiences students bring with them when they come into the schools that they need to succeed in the system. Teacher expectations, which are beliefs about the future, in this case regarding the student's performance at an academic task. And culturally responsive teaching is using the cultural knowledge, experiences, different learning styles of diverse students to make learning more effective for them. In other words, using a strength-based model, not a deficiency-based model. Even though I drew upon knowledge from previous courses and experiences from the past few years, I did a detailed literature review of 14 scholarly articles and books, and also conducted case studies, which included teacher interviews and observations. For bridging strategies, I used building complex and multi-causal explanations to explore the issue of why the system is dysfunctional for the teaching of immigrant students, and also to explore why the research in the field of education is not often used when it comes to forming policies and practices that happen in the classroom. I also found, during my literature review, I found conflicts between the disciplines of psychology and research done in the field of education in terms of teacher expectations. Psychological research stated that teacher expectations were not only accurate, but that had little effect on student performance, whereas educational research was more focused on the self-fulfilling prophecy and showed the impact of teacher expectations. And I used the strategy of advancing through checks and balances to explore that issue. I also created common ground by redefining the concept of cultural capital as a continuum, and found through my literature review as well as my interviews and observations that students with less cultural capital tended to be more affected by their teachers' low expectations. From my literature review, I found that the variables that affect the education of immigrant students go far beyond the confines of the classroom and are deeply rooted in historical, political, societal, and cultural contexts. I also found that student outcomes, regardless of teacher expectations, were highly contingent upon their current life situations and their backgrounds. From my interviews, I found that there was a wide variation in school policy. Teacher responses also varied greatly depending on their education, their experiences, and their training. I also found that the school may decide upon an official policy. For example, the ESL teacher of the school, the principal, and the classroom teacher may decide on how to implement tests and instruction in the class. But what happens in the classroom is often very different from that, and it depends upon the time and resources that are available to teachers. From my observations, I found that teachers' expectations pertain more towards students' effort than their academic abilities, and that immigrant students were not held to the same standards as their peers in terms of producing work. I also found that explicit instruction was not often given, and even in situations where resources and time was available, sometimes the teachers simply did not do it. And students' cultural capital also was not being used in their classrooms. Some of the limitations of this project were time constraints. I would have liked to do more interviews and more observations and read more books. There is plenty of literature that I think that I could have used for this project. And of course, unfortunately, I found that there's not a lot of literature available on populations other than African Americans and Hispanics. And even though there's lots of educational research on the teaching of immigrant students, literature from other disciplines focused mainly on the causes of the problem. I think this is important because the achievement gap continues into the employment sector. And according to the National Science Foundation, even as recently as 2010, only 5.3% of the workers in highly skilled jobs were Hispanics, which is far lower than their proportion in the general population. And this not only impacts our global academic standing at the primary and secondary school levels, but also impacts America's ability to lead in financial and technological sectors, and thereby affects the future of our country as a whole. And I believe it's important for one basic reason: the American dream. Our educational system is supposed to be an equalizer for all, and it should help everybody in achieving that American dream. Thank you.
We'll you interviewed teachers that you were working with as part of your work as an education student?
I'm not doing my internship currently, so it was, I contacted them and asked if I could come and observe and talk with them. And they were public school teachers, elementary, all of them, different grade levels. And their responses vary greatly depending on how their experience is not. I saw a difference between teachers who were, even though were 20, had been teaching for 20 years and was a great teacher, but her outlook and philosophy on minority students and teaching a diverse population is very different, mainly because she'd been trained 20 years ago. And another teacher who had started teaching since 2009, but was had been educated recently, had a very different outlook. In addition to some also teachers who had been abroad, had taught in other countries and were more familiar with students of various backgrounds, were also more aware of the cultural differences, the learning styles, and did not use the values of the majority really to judge them. For one example is parental involvement, which is a big factor in student success. And a teacher who is used to looking at parental involvement as a factor, that's really important. And judging students on who's a good student, who's not. You see a difference with the teacher who's more aware, knew that their parents are not always available and they may be very much involved in their students' education and care about it, but they can't always come to the meetings. And another teacher who said the opposite, actually, even during my interview with her, gave me one example later on and said that there was one student who I invited her mom and her mother didn't show up, the grandmother showed up, and I was disappointed. I thought, what's going on, this is not good. But eventually found out that the family was actually very much involved in the students' education. Yes?
Asbah, you talked about them using more informal assessments to create their expectations. What type of assessments were they looking at? Like anecdotal evidence?
Actually, assessment, I used, for this project, when I talk about assessment, I'm talking about what happens in the classroom, yes, how they're being graded. Yes. Even though the ESL program is something different, the ESL teacher does everything, my focus was on the mainstream teacher in the classroom. And I found out that little things can help a lot. Even if the teacher is not trained to teach students who are not proficient in English, just telling them that you have to do this, just write whatever you want and give it to me, will have the student working at least. And in more than one setting, I observed that the students were, especially those who were very recent immigrants, were kind of used to not doing anything, and that was accepted by their teacher. So, just even asking them is, do you need any help? What do you not know? For example, I observed the students were writing a journal about Easter, and there was one student who was a recent immigrant, and he didn't know about Easter. He didn't know what it was. And the teacher was walking around. She saw that he hadn't written anything, but did not really ask him like why, or what's wrong. Like, is there something I can help you with? And eventually, I shouldn't have intervened, but I asked the student sitting with him in the group to talk about Easter, tell him what it was, and then he wrote about it in his journal. So just a little bit. I'm not even a professional teacher yet. But even that little bit helps.
I just wonder, you showed a slide that showed African American data, and by and large, that's not considered an immigrant population, I think, any longer. Or
yes.
And I know that we have schools that are, particularly in the West Coast, primarily Asian. Mm-hmm. That's the majority group. And so it seems to me that the data you're using might be impacted a little bit by mixing this African American community into what is not an immigrant population.
That's
also, right. Where you have primarily a first or second generation population, say Koreans or Chinese or Japanese, your data would look completely different. Did you account for any of
the
that?
slide actually came from a website that was showing the national averages. However, in my literature, I focused mainly on immigrant populations. I did not focus on minorities like African Americans who are not considered immigrant. And that's why I mentioned that I found a lot there. Even then, if there was a lot on minorities, African Americans, and Hispanics, but there was much less on other populations. Even Asians, even though there's such a large population on the West Coast, right?
Asbah, I just wanted to follow on Patricia's question, because we did have a student a couple of years ago, Ben McDougall, who focused on educational advocacy for children of West African immigrants. And this relates to family involvement, where in a poll, in an interview, some of the parents expressed a desire not to contradict the authority of the teachers in their children's school, because culturally they felt it was wrong to be involved like a helicopter parent, that would be a challenge to the teacher's authority, is the way. So there are cultural differences in terms of the family's willingness to be involved based on whether they feel like they're stepping on the teacher's toes.
Yes, that's very relevant. That's one of the factors, and if the teacher is aware of that, is mindful of that, she would know that, you know, the parents are not doing much, not because they don't care, but maybe, you know, they think of it differently. They don't want to question the authority figure. And as students themselves, also in the classroom, many new immigrants are shy. They don't participate in class activities, and the teacher might mistake it for the student not knowing anything, whereas they may just be they're not used to in their old schools like I wasn't. It was discipline was very important. You'd not speak up unless you were asked to. So speaking up in class, like, it came with time.
Thank you very much.